So new details are emerging into the investigation into Prince's death. Law enforcement officials say there's no indication so far that he had a valid prescription for painkillers, ones that were found on him and in his home at the time of his death. Joining us now is former editor of People magazine, Larry Hackett. We also have with us this morning addiction expert Dr. Omar Manejwala. He is author of Craving: Why We Can't Seem to Get Enough. And Larry, you know, it's interesting because it has been confirmed that these prescription painkillers were on his body.
That's
they
right.
found them there at the home. We don't know so far. It's not saying that he did not absolutely have a prescription, but that aside, it's interesting how you and I have been here talking about this before. It's sort of a rampant issue, seemingly, within the celebrity world.
It does. And again, as you say, we need to kind of like, you know, put an asterisk on it. We don't know exactly what's happening. We don't. But it is taking on a similarity to another case of 7 years ago, which was Michael Jackson, right? I mean, a kind of reclusive star who, for one reason or another, seems to become under the grip of these opioids, and
you have somebody that's willing to give them to him.
You always are going to have that.
You're always. And Dr. Manejwala, I mean, that's a challenge, right? Because for all of the doctors that are doing good, conscientious work, you're always going to be able to find someone who's willing to cut corners and do a favor, especially when you have somebody in a position of power and fame and celebrity like this.
Well, not only is that true, but most of the people who are abusing these medications are actually not getting them from a doctor. They're getting them from a relative or friend. And then you also have the people that are getting them from a doctor. And yes, there are, you know, unscrupulous prescribers. These medicines are very easy to get and, as we've learned, can be very lethal.
Well, and it's interesting, too, because when we talk about the convergence of celebrity and addiction and access to these things, you know, oftentimes folks are surrounded, Larry, by people that are willing to make anything happen. Bagmen, yes men, you know, the people that'll sweep things under the carpet, help you out, and that's problematic.
It's really problematic. What's interesting about this case, though, is that he was known as being such a loner. He was a Jehovah's Witness. He was not a guy who lived a rock star lifestyle over 30 years. I mean, he wasn't someone who was out and about. So to me, it makes it, if this is where this is going, and if indeed his death was caused by this, it makes it all the more tragic, I think.
Doctor, let's talk about this issue of opioid addiction. It is an epidemic, is it not, in this nation?
Yeah, it's an epidemic for sure. We're 5% of the world's population, Americans are, and yet we consume 80% of the global supply of opiates. Wow. The number of prescriptions for these drugs have quadrupled since 1999. The number of overdose deaths have quadrupled since 1999. You know, you talk about, you know, one celebrity death possibly from these opiates. On average, 44 people die a day. That means there are 3 other grieving families that aren't in the headlines that are facing this epidemic right now. Children, I've comforted the families. It's absolutely an epidemic.
Well, and it's interesting too, because we've been talking about a lot on this show that it's sort of being seen by the recovery community as the medicine cabinet is the new drug dealer, and it's interesting because the stigma has sort of changed, right? I mean, the fact is, when you look at this, these aren't necessarily people that are living in the shadows. These are people that may have started out with some sort of injury and quickly found themselves spiraling out of control. Correct, doctor?
Yeah, that's right. In many cases, that's absolutely true. And now, even when you look at people who are using heroin, the vast majority of them now started with pain pills. And really, it's just an economic question of going to heroin. So absolutely, it's been casualized, and you saw the thing on SNL. So, it's a concern that access is so simple. Now, for example, adolescents are now using pain pills most commonly as their first high, not cannabis.
It's the easiest thing to get to.
It's now, right, exactly.
More can be done, obviously, in your opinion, to control this. Are we heading in the right direction?
Very slowly we are, but we're only scratching the surface. If a person shows up in an emergency room, for example, with this kind of problem, and there are 7,000 ER visits a day related to this problem, fewer than 10% will get adequate treatment for it. So we're not really deploying enough resources against prevention, against treatment. And when I say we're not doing enough by an order of magnitude. There's been a huge push in the right direction, but nowhere near enough.
Well, and I think as the doctor points out, the path is very interesting. It often is begun for legitimate reasons.
Yeah.
You know, we've heard reports that, you know, Prince
true.
had, you know, wore heels and he
Right.
had terrible hips.
Right.
So
and he may have had a surgery a few years back, et cetera.
So an initial prescription may have been for legitimate reasons, and then people, and this happens over and over and over again. And I think the doctor points out something that's also fascinating and horrifying, that the path is now from legitimate opioids to heroin because the heroin is cheaper. I mean, that's just mind-boggling.
This is obviously a conversation that I know New Day is going to continue on, and we hope to continue it, covering it as a network as well. Dr. Manejwala, Larry, always a pleasure. Thank you so much. We are following a whole lot of news today on this Friday, including violent protests at a